David Robson, welcome to the Development by David podcast. How are you, mate?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited for our conversation.
I'm going to ask with a big question up front. I'm going to lead in with this. What does it mean to be connected, David?
So I think fundamentally, there are lots of different ways that we could measure social connection. So it could just be the number of contacts we have, the number of followers we have on Instagram, the number of friends we have on Facebook. But I think what's really fundamental to connection is that we feel understood and supported by the people around us. And so that's why some people who on the outside seem to have lots of friends can still feel very lonely because they just don't feel understood by anyone within their network. You can even be married to someone, share the same bed as someone, but feel super lonely because you don't have that sense of connection. You don't have the feeling that your mind is kind of merged with that other person's, that you're both experiencing world in the same way. So scientists sometimes call that particular form of loneliness, where you're surrounded by people but also feel very apart from them. They refer to that as existential isolation. And so I see connectedness as being the opposite of existential isolation. It's when you feel that actually you're surrounded by a core group of people who just get you and understand you and see you.
What drove you personally to write this new book of yours, The 13 Laws of Connection? Was there an innate calling for you to solve this problem for this modern generation?
Yeah, I think there was. I mean, so it kind of came from two separate kind of bits of my existence. I think professionally, as a science writer, I've been aware of lots of research showing how important social connection is for our health and well-being. So there's so much research showing that people who feel that sense of understanding and support live longer. They're less susceptible to all kinds of illnesses like Alzheimer's, heart attacks, stroke, even the common cold, diabetes. The list just goes on. And that's because when we feel a sense of connection, there's a physiological effect to that. It actually uh, kind of reduces our stress response to all kinds of events, and it can do things like enhance the immune system when you have like this suppressed stress response. So fundamentally, like social connection is hugely important. It's we have a desire for social connection that's very similar to our desire for food or water or sex. It's like a fundamental kind of uh, nutrient for our existence. But at the same time as knowing all of this research, I have in the past felt quite lonely myself, and that came from a kind of shyness that I'd always carried with me and this kind of social anxiety. So I had that as a teen. Kind of carried it through university, and it's weird because I was kind of making friends at each stage of my life, but I almost couldn't trust that that wasn't a fluke. It always felt like whenever I met like another group of people, like there was always this fear of rejection. And so I really wanted to know, like, if social connection is so important, like how could I overcome those fears, and how could I be better at kind of making new friends without all of that discomfort and worry. And then it just happened that I came across like a whole body of literature that's looked at exactly that, and is asking, what are the psychological barriers for social connection? Why is shyness so common amongst so many different people? Why are even extroverts and confident um, and people with huge social confidence, like, why aren't they always getting the kind of close connection that they desire? Like, why can some people have hundreds of Facebook friends but still feel lonely, and what's going wrong with their communication? So I started gathering the papers, and I kind of quickly realized that there were these kind of fundamental laws that govern our sense of connection with other people, and that often these psychological barriers were just very easy to overcome. And then once I learned that, I kind of wanted to share it with as many people as I could.
I'm really glad you did start sharing that, David. If I were to reflect on my father's upbringing and compare it to mine, it would be very hard for us to distinguish by looking at him how many friends or connections or nodes that he has in his social network. But now, fast forward 50 years in my generation, all you have to do is go on someone's Twitter following or Instagram following, and it's so easy to qualify their the status of their connections and quantify the numerical nature of that. We can see David Robson has X amount of thousand Twitter followers, and we would be mistaken to think that that means he is more connected than someone 50 years ago. But through reading your literature and reading your work, it seems like we are more disconnected than ever. Would that be correct?
Well, I mean, this is very difficult for us to know because actually the data is quite poor. I think there's definitely this sense that the way that our society is constructed today, so people tend to not live so close to their families. More people are living alone. Um, we're spending more time on our screens, which is like technology can be an instrument for connection. So, I don't think we should underestimate how nice it is that we can speak to family members in, on a completely different continent through video calls in a way that just wouldn't have been possible beforehand. But still, face to face physical presence is the best way to form social connection. So there are certain disadvantages, I think, of the modern era when it comes to social connection. Um, but we also do know, looking at the data, what surveys, they were taken like 50 years ago. We know that people even back then did frequently felt lonely. And I think they might have just been experiencing that existential isolation. So they might have seen more people potentially than we meet today physically, but they didn't necessarily feel much closer to them. And they had their own problems. So I think there was, less openness about things like mental illness, which meant that lots of people were carrying a lot of pain secretly, which would have led them to feel that kind of loneliness. People couldn't disclose things like their sexuality, or if they had an unhappy marriage, it was very hard for them to escape that. So, I think it's it's kind of a case of swings and roundabouts, I think. But certainly, there are different challenges that we face today that we should be aware of. And so, yeah, I talk about that in the book as well, like how we can apply the laws of connection to, our life online as well as our kind of physical interactions with people.
During my walk to record this podcast today, David, I was thinking to myself, and I completely debunked my own theory. I was thinking to myself, how can people be more or equally as disconnected now than ever before when online we have the ability to showcase so many characteristics, tastes, and traits and interests? How can that influence our level to be our propensity to be extroverted and the opposite of shy? But in fact, I realized that most people present a false version of themselves online
Mm.
anyway, so they're still living in a liminal concealment.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. It's like so I think, that kind of the fact that we don't always have to be authentic online can create a couple of different problems. First of all, I think the fact that other people are doing that means that we often engage in this sense of competition. We kind of see everyone else having a fabulous life, and then we um, compare that to our own lives, and we know all the gory details and the mess of our own lives, and we kind of wonder why other people don't experience that. So we don't get this sense of sharing, this shared humanity that comes from having stresses and unhappiness within our lives. We feel quite isolated because of that. But then also, I think, like, if we are then presenting this inauthentic front, where we're kind of airbrushing the kind of the kind of the unhappiness within our life or the dissatisfaction, then we're not allowing then by preventing other people from empathizing with that, we don't feel that connection to our own problems either from the other people. They're not coming to us and saying, like, we support you, we want to, we want to talk to you if you're unhappy, or we want to you know help you if you're feeling ill and you need are lifted the hospital or whatever, like, because we're not sharing the information that really matters. We're not getting the support that we need either. So it goes both ways.
I remember hearing Aubrey Marcus on your friend Chris Williamson's podcast, and he basically lacerated my brain with this quote, and David, I'll never forget it, and it brings a lot of your work to life. He says, "The ego is only available to receive praise, not love."
Yeah, it's totally true. Um, and yeah, so I think, like, one of the things that I learned, I think, very early on in researching the book is that actually we can kind of put the ego to one side. Once we do that, we will find a lot more social connection, like meaningful social connection.
How would you define meaningful social connection, David?
Um, So I think, like, what's fundamental to social connection is having a shared reality with someone. So I kind of touched on that earlier when I spoke about the opposite of social connection, which is existential isolation. Well, shared reality is when you feel that other people are sharing the same view of the world, the same experience of the world with you. Um, so that can come from lots of things, like simply kind of agreeing on, like, the outcome of an event is one form of a shared reality. So um if you uh if you kind of witness someone being mugged and you both agree that that was an act of violence, that's a form of shared reality. But what really seems to matter is, like, how intimate your shared reality can be. So it's not just agreeing on the facts, it's also agreeing on the kind of feelings that an event can provoke. It could be something as simple as kind of laughing at the same joke. If you're in a crowded room in the office, and only two people laugh at the same joke, they're likely to still feel a sense of shared reality with each other, because they know that that person was processing the event in the same way as them. Similarly, if you both know that you kind of feel shivers at the same point in a song, that's a very visceral reaction, that shows that there's something going on beneath the skull that's meaningful to both of you. Um, there's a lot of research showing that the more you share those kinds of experiences, the closer you feel to them. It can get to the point where you feel that your two minds have merged. It's almost as if you're sharing a stream of consciousness. And I think we experience this whenever we click with someone, and all of those behaviors, like when you end someone's sentences because you already know what they're going to say, or you say the same thing at the same time, that is a sign of an intimate shared reality, because your brains just seem to be working on the same wavelength. So for me, that is the kind of most important thing that we have to protect when we're trying to create a social connection. We have to kind of aim to form that shared reality with someone.
I can imagine creating conditions to host that shared reality involves being quite vulnerable, open, transparent in nature, sharing some of your idiosyncrasies and peculiarities. Do you have like an actionable step that someone can take to create the conditions for that shared reality?
Totally. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we don't do enough is actually validating other people when they say something that reveals a vulnerability. I think, like, we might try to make it clear that we kind of agree or empathize with them. But I think it's much more powerful if you can say, yeah, I've been through that too. I've felt the same as you did in similar circumstances. We can only say that if it's true, but I think, emphasizing those kind of shared moments or shared feelings can be really powerful in creating the shared reality. And I think a lot of us just have a natural reserve that might make us hold back a little bit. Um, there are also, weirdly, some kind of physical kind of things that we can do to create a shared reality. So, what the neuroscience shows is that when people have a shared reality, their brains start working in synchrony. So, actually, you can look at the activation of different regions of the brain, and they seem to be mirroring each other, these two people. And the more they mirror each other, the more they they like each other, because they're kind of experiencing the same things at the same time, and that's very bonding. And there are certain activities that can encourage that process. So actually dancing together,
Thinking that, like,
singing together. Yeah,
I was picturing, like, salsa classes or bachata classes. I
exactly.
often
Yeah,
like, in my teens, I was going to these, Latin clubs, and I was often
yeah.
mesmerized by 2 strangers who could dance to a song that they had never danced to together before, but they had this weird
Mm.
innate ability to left step when the other person left stepped and right step when the other person right stepped, and they became embodied with each other, and
Yeah.
it all makes sense now, David.
Yeah, and it's kind of incredible. And then, there have been a lot of studies looking at the consequences of that. And you find that when people have like danced together, sung together, even just kind of performing like aerobic movements in synchrony with each other, um, you find that they kind of report liking each other more, but they also then become a lot more altruistic to each other. They tend to agree more on kind of their core principles. It almost is as if their minds have started to merge, because once their physical bodies have started to act in sync, that's kind of primed their brains to do the same, and then they feel that their identities have somehow kind of joined together in some way. So it's very powerful.
I can imagine the extreme example of this that people can picture and perhaps relate to is the military.
Yeah,
There is a level of shared suffering that you'd endure in the military. You live in the same living conditions, wearing the same uniform, marching at the same beats per
yeah,
minute as your brothers and sisters. And the reason privates in the army or the infantry kill an opponent is not to kill the opponent, it's to save the lives of their brothers and sisters. And I can
yeah.
imagine that level of motivation derives from that shared sense of reality that they have in base camp and the bunks together and the pits together. And I can imagine the militant experience is a prime example of that.
Yeah, it totally is. And so, we probably evolved this capacity to bond over, those kind of synchronized movements, and even, the very idea of forming a shared reality at all evolved way back in our prehistoric past, as humans started to live together in bigger and bigger groups. So we went from being kind of primates that maybe live just a dozen of like individuals together to living in groups of hundreds of people, and then in like huge societies, and these behaviors probably helped us to do that. They provide that kind of social glue, and so then institutions start forming around this, like religions that encourage people to perform those rituals en masse. And yeah, one of the reasons I think is that was to bond people together so that they would be more effective warriors. Another reason is because the greater altruism between the individuals would have meant kind of more sharing of food and resources, which helps each individual. But more importantly, it allows the group to grow as a whole, because each person can depend on the others. You can manage to kind of survive with bigger and bigger groups.
And then the downside effect of reproduction and continuation and existential longevity hinges on that as well.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So actually, the pain that we feel when we're lonely is because we've evolved to have this kind of really strong signal that your relationships might be in danger. You either need to find new alliances, or you need to kind of refresh and tend to and heal your previous alliances. So, it's in much the same way that we feel physical pain is telling us to tend a wound, social pain is telling us to tend the kind of fractures in our relationships.
So we've spoken about how we should create a mutual understanding with the people we meet by focusing on the peculiar ways that we connect. Why is it important to be consistent in your treatment of others?
Mm. Yeah, that comes from a lot of this epidemiological research that's looked at the health benefits of social connection. And like I said, in general, it's not just the number of ties, but the quality of your ties that predicts all of these health benefits and ultimately your mortality. Um, and so, if you look at anyone's social network, like all of the people that they know, you will have some people who are just purely supportive, who are always going to be there to help you. They're very rarely hurtful, and you'd hope that's going to be the majority of the people that you know. There's going to be some people, like maybe some like pretty unpleasant relative, or it could be a colleague at work, who they're just kind of consistently like pretty nasty. Like, you're never going to turn to them for help or support because you know you're never going to get what you want. There's no real sense of true connection there. You only know them because you have to kind of be physically present when they're present for whatever reason. They're just, we call those aversive ties. But what we know is that a lot of people kind of sit in between these two extremes, and these are the ambivalent relationships, or frenemies as we might call them in kind of everyday language. So they can be they blow hot and cold. They can be your best friend one day, and then they can really lash out at you the next. And we know that those people can actually be just as stressful, or sometimes more stressful, than the people who are just consistently horrible, because they create this uncertainty, this stress. You just don't know what they're going to do next. You kind of crave their approval, and when you don't get it, it's especially hurtful. Whereas for someone who's purely aversive, you kind of learn not to really care what they say. It just, you can write them off. And so, for one thing, like, I think knowledge of this kind of categorization of relationships can be useful, because we can, when we realize someone's an ambivalent friendship, we can just kind of manage our expectations. We can go into each interaction thinking, well, like, recognizing I don't know what they're going to do on this particular day, and maybe actually it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would do. Like, maybe I just have to accept that they're not as nice as I thought. But we also have to make sure that we're not frenemies ourselves. We're not these ambivalent relationships ourselves, and it's totally possible that we could be without realizing it, because we're quite egocentric creatures, human beings, and so it could be that we're just not, we're neglecting people in a way that we haven't even noticed. Like, maybe you're the kind of person who's always late turning up to meet your friend, and your friend finds that really insulting. It's like, you don't, it's, to them, it's, you might not care if people are late, but to them it's sending this signal that you really don't value them, or they really care about their birthday, and you never send a message to wish them a happy birthday. Or you always, and this is something that I'm really bad at, you always let the other person try to arrange to meet up, because you never actually do it yourself, and then that starts to look as if you are just happy to let the friendship go. So we should be aware of these behaviors, and try to be more consistent. Like, if we really value people, we should make an extra effort to show that we value them, and to take notice of the things that they really care about, and make sure that we're not kind of accidentally putting them in this nasty state of uncertainty.
In the self audit of being a frenemy, it makes me think of your fourth law in your book, which is check assumptions, engage in perspective getting rather than perspective taking to avoid egocentric thinking. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so essentially, a lot of research in a lot of writing about social relationships in the past has kind of told people to kind of put yourself in the other person's shoes. Like, imagine what their life is like, and then act accordingly. And this is meant to enhance your empathy, this imaginative exercise. The problem is that we're often, like, not very good at doing that. And it's too much to expect. Like, you haven't lived another person's life and had all their experiences, so you don't necessarily know what they believe in a certain, what they believe about a certain topic, how they would respond to, like, a certain event. When you have the shared reality, you might temporarily feel like you do, but you can never take that for granted, because if you make a mistake and you make this kind of wrong assumption about how they think or feel, that's very jarring, and actually then kind of threatens that sense of shared reality. It kind of underlines the fact that your minds aren't actually merged, it just feels like that. Even no matter how close we are to people, we're never going to know them 100% of the time. So just putting ourselves in other people's shoes isn't necessarily the most accurate or effective way of of kind of understanding their behavior. And put simply, the best thing to do is to just ask, like a simple question like, what do you think of this? Would you like, like if you're treating someone for their birthday or whatever, like just asking them like, would you like to go to this gig or this show or whatever, rather than just making that assumption. Unless, there are tactful ways of doing that where you don't have to kind of spoil the surprise. But being humble about what we do know about other people, and double checking that our assumptions are correct, that's really important for protecting this shared reality. Because however well we know someone, we can always be surprised by them. And actually, that is what keeps the spark alive in any kind of friendship or relationship, is keeping your mind open to the fact that they are going to do things that are unpredictable. And by learning about those kind of surprises, you can actually get even closer to them.
Why are we so afraid of asking about others' preferences? Is it because we think, or we preordain that the recipient will think that we don't know enough about them, or we haven't been paying close enough attention to them, or they haven't been a priority? Therefore, the signal of us asking is a signal of unattentiveness. Do you think that's what is the deterrent for us asking in the first place?
Yeah, I think it is. But I think it's one of these unfounded assumptions, because I reckon that
Mm.
actually, I mean, so there's a lot of research showing that when you ask people questions, they find it very flattering. And I think that is true whether you're meeting a stranger or whether it's someone you've lived with for 50 years. Just saying to that person, like, you know, I'm curious, what do you think of this? I think, it's rarely going to go down badly. But yeah, obviously there are some things that you do know very well, but I think whenever there's room for doubt, I think just double checking is always going to be better than making some kind of decision where you're showing that you don't actually understand them as well as you believe.
As a podcast host, I now feel like I have flattered over 100 people now. Thanks for that, David. I've asked so many questions over the last few years. I now feel so chivalrous in nature.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's it's definitely something that I love about appearing on these shows, is like getting the chance to kind of make that connection. But I also do love hearing what hosts think. I think it's nice when the conversation goes both ways.
One thing that I really want to ask you that blew my mind in your book was the better than average effect. What is the better than average effect?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting one when it comes to social relationships, actually. So in general, like we're the average person is quite arrogant. They think they are better than average at almost every skill that you can think of. So if you ask people, how good a driver are you? The majority of people say they're better than average. And or say, how good are you at maths? How intelligent are you? Like, statistically speaking, that's very very hard. Like, there are some pedants would tell me that there are situations where you can have the majority of people who are better than average. But I mean, in general, it's not like that, because most distributions are symmetrical, where the average is dead center and half of people are below average, half of people are above average. But yeah, so it's a logical fallacy that people fall for. It's kind of a cognitive bias, the better than average effect. Um, but what I was so surprised to find out when writing my book was the fact that we might have the better than average effect when we're appraising our own skills, but we are underconfident when we think about how other people might perceive us. So even though I might think that I'm more intelligent than the average person, I also am likely to underestimate how intelligent you think I am, how funny I am, how conscientious I am, all of these kind of traits. There's something about considering another person's perception of us that makes us very kind of pessimistic and shy. And one of the kind of examples of this that's most relevant to my book is that we are especially likely to have this, it's called a faulty meta perception, when it comes to how likable we are. So we always, the average person underestimates how much another person likes them. We always think we're going to be perceived a lot worse than we really are.
Is that the liking gap that you referenced in your book?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So we call this like faulty meta perception the liking gap. And yeah, it's simply that if you have two people, who've just met, they can both really enjoy the conversation, then they both go away. Each person, um, thinks that they liked the other person a lot more than the other person liked them. And that kind of drives a wedge between them because essentially they'd formed a shared reality. And then when they go away, they start doubting that the shared reality was real. They think maybe the other person was faking it. They start thinking about their kind of faux pas that they might have made, like all of those clumsy little clumsy sentences they said, or when they repeated themselves when they thought the other person was bored. All those fears are mostly unfounded. Like the other person isn't focusing on like your slip ups. What they're really focusing on is like how warm and kind you are, how interested you are, how interesting you are. All of these different things. It's the overall like vibe of the conversation that matters more than the small details that we agonize over.
I had a recent example of this in my personal life, David. I'll share it
Mm,
online. In my spare time, I also do stand-up comedy. And
mm,
recently, I went to our kind of hallmarked stand-up comedy club, the Stand Comedy Club, on their infamous Tuesday night, which is called Red Raw. And it's a night for new comics to try new material or experienced comics to try new material. And I went on a date there to watch
mm,
the comedy with this first date who didn't know that I was a stand-up comedian. And I got to the front door, and the lady that was checking the tickets asked me, "David, do you want a spot tonight? Someone's pulled out. We've got 5 minutes. You can go on second." And I turned to the lady that I was on a date with, and I asked her. She said that was fine, but she was confused to why the receptionist asked if I wanted 5 minutes. However,
mm,
I kind of buckled myself up, did all my mental triggers, visualization, all the things I do before a gig.
mm,
Went backstage with the pro comedians and the budding comedians, and geared myself up for my set. I went out on stage, did my 5 minutes, but in my opening line, I stuttered one word for like a
mm.
millisecond, David. But I thought I
Yeah,
lost trust in the entire room. And
yeah.
throughout my entire set, I was laboring in my mind whilst telling the jokes that I had stuttered. And I was so
Mm,
embarrassed to get off the stage and go back through the curtain to the bar to meet the girl that I was
mm,
at a date with. I was expecting her to be cringing out because I stuttered this one word.
mm,
And in fact, the first thing she said to me, "Oh my god, that was amazing." I was like pissing myself
mhm.
laughing. And I thought,
Yeah,
she's just saying that because she doesn't want it to
yeah.
be awkward. Anyway, a few nights pass and I go watch another stand-up comedy show on my own at our O2 academy that's here. And after the show, I go outside and I meet one of the other comedians that were on the bill that night. And he
Mm.
came out and said, "David, that was amazing that you went up on stage in 5 minutes notice and you had the whole room pissing themselves. That was like a great set. That's the best
Yeah,
I've ever seen you." And only then, now that I had two sources of evidence, I was able to affirm that the gig went all right. But for
yeah.
maybe the 3 or 4 days, I was totally ruminating on that one stutter, and my perception was that the whole audience noticed that and disliked me. But in fact, it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is exactly what's happening in so many of these cases. And what I find interesting with like what you said is that even like when your date told you that she found it hilarious, because we know the social norms of like politeness, we discount praise too much. Actually, um we we need like firm watertight evidence before we believe that someone is that someone didn't actually notice that thing that's been playing on our mind for so long. So yeah, it's one of the reasons why I think that we could all learn to practice more self-compassion. And like if you don't like the sound of like self-compassion, like I don't blame you because it sounds like quite a woolly kind of concept, and it makes you think of like having like a nice hot chocolate or whatever, and like putting your feet up.
Instagram
Nothing wrong
quotes
with
have
that
killed that,
either.
David.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. Is that it sounds quite superficial, and we kind of associate it with things like indulgence, which we maybe don't want to kind of be seen to be like indulgent. But actually, self-compassion is just treating yourself with the kind of kindness and support that you would hope that you would treat the people who you're closest to with the same kind of kindness and compassion. And it's just recognizing that we all screw up sometimes, and most of those mistakes are not a catastrophe. And I'm recognizing that actually there's ways that we can get over those errors, even if they are pretty terrible. And one of the things is to know that it's one of the things that unites humanity is the fact that we all have these moments of suffering, whether that's like a small like slip up in a stand-up gig, or whether that's like being cancelled on the world stage. It's like, these things happen to so many people. And yeah, I think like, when we practice self-compassion like profoundly and make it part of our philosophy for life, there's so much research showing that that can improve so many outcomes, like health outcomes. When you practice self-compassion, you're actually more likely to make amends for any mistakes or to correct your behavior, to enact behavioral change. So yeah, curing the kind of liking gap, I think, is just one of the many benefits of self-compassion.
One of my favorite chapters in your book was talking about expressing appreciation. And there's an amazing theory or concept or framework called the gratitude gap that I learned about. Can you bring to life what the gratitude gap is?
Yeah, I mean, this it's kind of my own coinage actually that I'm trying to kind of cover, like a lot of research that shows that basically we just don't show gratitude as much as we should. We don't compliment people as much as we should either. So it's also a kind of more general kind of appreciation gap, I guess, is that we often feel really good things about other people, but we just don't say them explicitly enough. And there are lots of reasons for that. We might assume the other person knows how great they are. We often worry that our compliments are going to be quite clumsy and awkward, and that we're going to seem kind of ingratiating and like a bit creepy almost. So we bite back those warm thoughts. We don't say them, and we just kind of go on as if it's already kind of out there. What we don't realize is that like the other person would really appreciate hearing the compliment or the expression of gratitude much more than we expect. When we do say, these kind of things to people, we feel a lot better as well as the other person. It's not really that kind of awkwardness that we expect. Um, and there's a benefit to both people, not just in their kind of positive feelings that it creates. Like it does just create a positive vibe when it shouldn't be surprising, but apparently it goes against our kind of intuitions, that it creates this positive vibe and helps you feel closer to each other. When you compliment people or express gratitude, it can also actually calm the physiological stress response, because it's kind of underlining that sense of connection. It's reinforcing your sense of connection when you do that. So there's this study that mimicked the Dragon's Den show, or like Shark Tank for American listeners, where students had to kind of come up with a kind of project and then present it to a team for like of judges for a prize. They felt a bit stressed about this, as you would do, because it's no one wants to feel that they're kind of on the spot being judged. But the researchers found if just one member of each pair expressed gratitude to the other person for their work and their contribution, then both members had a kind of reduced physiological response to the stress they were feeling. So they still were kind of energized and charged up by the event, but they weren't tipping over into that fight or flight response that can be very inhibiting. It's kind of bad for us physiologically, and it can actually be very distracting when you go into kind of panic mode rather than just feeling kind of energized for the challenge ahead.
And I learned in your book that the neurotic response, or the kind of emotional well-being response of receiving a compliment or appreciation or gratitude, is just as much as you would get from receiving a physical gift. And if you look at it through an economist point of view, the cost of the compliment is £0, and the cost of, I don't know, an expensive bunch of flowers is £50. An economist would look at that
Yeah.
and think, well, there's an imbalance there. But from a psychological point of view, opposed to a logical point of view, they are almost balanced, if not the complement is greater.
Yeah, exactly. So there are studies within organizations that have compared like showing gratitude or complimenting employees compared to giving them kind of small bonuses for their work. And by a bonus, I don't mean like a kind of £100,000 paycheck, but like a £25 gift voucher or whatever for like a week's good work. Say coming kind of the top in your team. And yeah, they found that the uh, kind of expressions of gratitude were actually more motivating for the employees than receiving the financial gift. So yeah, it's and then we look at the brain processing, and actually, like you said, it's the same areas are responding to receiving a compliment or gratitude or um, receiving like cash. So yeah, it can be very powerful. I'm always a bit kind of wary of companies taking this too literally because in one of my jobs, I was like being paid like 30% less than my direct colleagues, and my boss was always very complimentary about my work. But eventually, I was like, I'm really pleased that you are so proud of my performance, but that's not going to pay my mortgage. like,
Yeah,
and even in that situation, they were giving like prizes of like I think it's like £100 Amazon gift voucher, and I was like, fine, like I am grateful for that, but I need to get the correct compensation. And I think this is a danger that sometimes companies will um try to like save money by just kind of giving out just by showing their gratitude, but actually no, you need both. You can be rewarded financially and also your boss can show their appreciation.
David, at the end of the month, I'm going to phone my landlord and tell him, look, I've not got rent this month, but what you do have is beautiful,
Right.
beautiful eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this I think the comparison goes so far, and it's super interesting from a scientific perspective that the brain is processing material gain or kind of social gain in the same way. But from a practical perspective for businesses, I think they need to realize like what's really important for employees' overall quality of life.
Have you ever shopped at an espresso, David?
No, I don't think I have actually.
So
Yeah.
it's very topical. Yesterday, I went to the Nespresso in our main shopping
Mm,
street in Glasgow, Buchanan Street. Popped into the store to um, restock my pods that I use for my machine. And usually, I would just buy these online.
yeah.
I wasn't really aware of their phenomenal employee and customer experience or total experience to put the two terms together. And I went in and I started speaking to the gentleman behind the counter. His name was James. And the fact I remember that just showcases how much of a
Mm,
immersion I had. And I asked him what it was like to work at Nespresso, because all of the interior design was it looked recyclable, it looked sustainable, and he went on this huge tangent about the Nespresso brand, its history, um, his story working there. It was very detailed and in full color, and I asked him to kind of summarize his employee experience, and the first thing that he mentioned was that whenever they have a senior leadership meeting, 2 days in advance, that he receives a hamper with some snacks because Nespresso know that he's gonna be in this meeting for 3 hours, and they fuel all of their staff members with
mm,
shortcake and cans of juice, and that costs maybe, what, 15, £20, £30
yeah.
max, but I can imagine the the levels of productivity that he is motivated to deploy because of that little touch point is
Yeah.
tenfold that in terms of revenue generation.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like kind of financial compensation is important, appreciation is hugely important. And, I think both actually can be money savers for the company because, you know, the feeling that you're not being appreciated is one of the biggest causes of burnout amongst employees. So you're losing a lot of money through sick days. People are just less likely to stay committed to their job. So even if they're working they're probably not working as hard as they could be, and it increases employee turnover. Like, it's one of the biggest reasons that people leave their current positions, and that is also very expensive. Like, hiring is a huge expense. So yeah, there's just a huge business case for making sure that managers understand this new science.
How do organizations create a culture whereby authenticity, vulnerability, shared reality is encouraged without it
Mm.
feeling like lip service, but equally, how do they do it in a way or communicate it in a way that won't upset their company values or bottom line? How can organizations stay goal congruent whilst displaying a authentic message around this type of communication, please?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't feel like it should ever be uh, in competition with like a company's kind of core values or purpose, because actually, people work a lot better when they feel connected with their colleagues. Connection, I mentioned some of the health benefits, but it can also improve things like employee creativity as well. If you have lots of people who feel close enough that they can exchange honest feedback with each other and that they can ask each other for fruitful collaborations, that can only be a good thing. So there's studies on like the liking gap in organizations, and actually, there's good evidence that when people do feel that liking gap because the kind of corporate culture hasn't allowed them to get over the liking gap and to form more meaningful connections with their colleagues, they're just less likely to, they are less effective at working together as a team. So I think like, like some of it is just, I think, like pretty obvious. Like, I went for a job interview at one place, and they were like, "This is not the kind of office where we have water cooler chat." And it's like, well, that's really not going to be a create. And this was like actually a creative agency. That's also totally counterproductive for their aims. Actually, if you can't feel that you can pick your colleagues' brains about a work problem and maybe chat about stuff like personal stuff too, then you're not going to have like a great working environment for collaboration. So I think like it should be, made explicit actually that you value the kind of social um, that you value the social elements of work. It's not just about making money; it's also creating a good social environment that can be made explicit, creating plenty of opportunities for kind of team bonding, and it doesn't have to be in those cringeworthy kind of ice-breaking activities or away days or anything like that. Actually, it could just be part of your culture where you have like employee drinks every month or every couple of months, that you pay for a decent Christmas party. That, and make sure that your managers model these behaviors too. So a manager who kind of expresses their kind of vulnerability and authenticity and doesn't always have to worry about kind of impression management and pretending to be perfect in every way, that's going to trickle down to all of their employees as well to encourage more honest communication.
Leaving the workplace and going back to the individual and how the listener can implement some of these laws or be aware of these laws and implement strategies to defend against them or to embrace them. How can interrupting someone build rapport? But because
Yeah.
I read that in your book, and surely interrupting one is someone is a sense of rudeness and self-importance. But based on what you've written
Right.
about, it's
Yeah.
the complete opposite.
Right, yeah. So I think there's like there are different kinds of interruptions. And so I think the kind of interruption that you should always avoid is when someone is like talking about something that really matters to them and you just cut across them and start saying something on a completely tangential subject, or they're giving their opinion and you're like, no, 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 I think you're wrong about that, and then just go and give your opinion without even hearing them out. Like, I absolutely don't think that that kind of interruption is at all valuable. But I think like a lot of interruptions are much more benign and actually underline our connection with other people, because they demonstrate the shared reality. So if I'm kind of trailing off in a sentence and you fill in a few words, it shows that we're both thinking on the same wavelength. That's a very good way of bonding, for me to know that you've got me, you've understood me, and then that you're kind of offering like a helping hand when I'm maybe struggling to express myself. So that kind of interruption, I think, is absolutely useful. Talking like with if someone's saying something and then you're responding with like real enthusiasm because you totally agree with what they say, I think that's a very flattering form of interruption. So I personally have always found it difficult to believe that anyone could find that insulting. And then that's what I found in the research, is that actually people feel much closer when, if you observe conversations of people on dates, for example, and they do a lot of that kind of interruption, they're much more likely to form a kind of good bond compared to people who kind of hold back a bit and kind of take their turn in the conversation, but without ever, like completing their sentences, talking over each other, reaffirming that they're thinking, the same things at the same time.
David, if I go on some speed dating or for my next date and I cut across the conversation of my date by finishing her sentences and I get them wrong and she never speaks to me again and calls me rude and blocks my
Right.
number, I'm going to tell her that you told me to do it, mate.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm happy to happy to take responsibility for that. Yeah.
I trust you. I trust you.
Yeah.
Tell me about the novelty penalty.
Yeah. So I think like this is quite familiar to us, but we just haven't had a name for it before. This is the fact that often people prefer to hear stuff that's familiar to them, and when we tell something totally kind of new and original that they haven't experienced in their own life, they can actually find that like a bit more boring and less engaging than hearing about something they already know. So this study that showed this involved like small groups of participants, watching each participant watched one of two potential videos. One was on like how to make a particular kind of ice cream. I think the other one was on like the intelligence of crows. Anyway, the one of the participants like watched one of these videos and then told the other participants what they'd watched. Now, the other participants found it much like enjoyed that conversation, that presentation a lot more when they heard about the video that they had already just seen, compared to if they heard about a video that they hadn't seen, which sounds totally counterintuitive, because why would you enjoy hearing about something you already know? Like that should be more boring than learning about something totally fresh to you. But that wasn't the case. And so the researchers were like pretty perplexed and looked into why that is. And the problem seems to be that like when we talk about something totally new, people the people telling the story often miss some of the most crucial details, like, why was that so important? What was the purpose of the um like what was the purpose of that video that you're telling me about? Like, why should I even care about it? And then, there might be missing details in the narrative itself that you're telling, so it's difficult to kind of connect the points together. um
So it
Whereas
becomes
if
more
you
psychologically
already
taxing on the recipient of the
right,
information.
it's more psychologically taxing, and they're just struggling to kind of make as much sense of it, or to understand like what is so interesting or amazing. If you've already seen the video before, you can fill in those gaps. It's much easier. It's much less mentally taxing, and you already get kind of what the points of interest are. So hearing them again is just kind of reminding you of that pleasure you'd had. Um, that's kind of quite an artificial experiment, but I think like we probably have experienced this ourselves. Like if we're telling people about a holiday we've been on, and then you kind of see their eyes like glazing over because they're not really that interested in where you've been or what you've done. It can seem super rude when people are doing that, but I think it is the novelty penalty. For you, like all of the kind of dazzling sights and sounds and the emotions you were feeling were so present and prominent for you as you're telling the story, but you're not communicating them enough, and so the other person can't really get like why it was so special or why you want to kind of share that experience. And so I think, like, my interpretation of this is that um, when we're kind of talking about new experiences that are really important for us, we should just give more of those intimate details, the things that help to create the shared reality, that help the other person to kind of relive that experience. So talk a bit more about, like, what it was that you found, like, so exciting, why you feel like this particular experience was the kind of defining moment in your life. Like, help the other person to live that with you, rather than assuming that they're just going to get it without that extra information.
I've faced this firsthand. I spoke offline that I'm a huge proponent of social mobility. It's something a cause that I've been championing for a while. And one of the paradoxes of being socially mobile is that your experiences might change. You might have new tastes and traits. And primarily, or individualistically, with myself, like I had the opportunity to go interview Jimmy Carr a couple of weeks ago in person, a hero of mine, an experience
Yeah,
that none of my friends get the opportunity to do. Equally, in
yeah.
2020, I had the opportunity to Zoom call Her Majesty the Queen in a very similar fashion
Oh,
and share my
wow.
story with
Yeah,
her.
yeah,
A really great, unique experience. And I can see a huge divide between the way I communicated the initial with the Queen in 2020 and the way I communicated my experience with Jimmy Carr.
yeah,
When I introduced the opportunity of meeting the Queen, the first thing that I was presented with, David, was when I shared the video to them. They said, "David, why are you speaking like a wanker?" They shot me down instantly, tall
Oh,
poppy
wow.
syndrome,
Yeah,
because I didn't
yeah,
give them context to why I was doing it. I just sent them the raw footage of the video, and I was expecting
yeah,
confetti and celebration, but in fact,
yeah,
I didn't give any reasoning to why I was doing that. But then fast forward 3 or 4 years when I interviewed Jimmy Carr, someone that they also kind of know the social status of, uh, I spoke more openly about the experience, about my nerves going into it,
yeah,
how I was feeling before, some of the moments where I fucked up on the podcast or thereafter,
yeah.
and how intimidated I was by his intellectual prowess, and how we went to
Mm.
Weatherspoons with my sister afterwards. Jimmy didn't come.
Oh,
My
yeah.
sister and I went to Weatherspoons after. So I made it way more relatable to them. And in fact,
Yeah.
that got a completely different response. They started to
Mm.
ask more questions, um, primarily around how I felt in that seat. And
Yeah.
the polarity between the two situations was context and detail and vulnerability. But I
Yeah.
guess one of the
Yeah.
questions what I had on that is, if being on a social mobility journey, and for the listeners to break that down to plain English, is just becoming more economically
Mm.
advanced, or moving between social status through education or employment or economics. If moving between those social classes creates new experiences, but those experiences are not incentivized by your initial tribe, how can one stay motivated to seek out those new experiences when the incentivization systems aren't rewarding?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I face myself, actually. So I came from, like, a working class background. Like, I was the first person in my family to go to university. My dad was like a lorry driver. And yeah, it's quite difficult for you to, like, articulate to your family when they've lived in having completely different experiences from what you're now kind of living through. Like, it can be really difficult to communicate that, and it can feel quite alienating, actually. So yeah, it is tricky. Yeah, I mean, in my personal life, I don't think I've, like, totally cracked it, but I do think something that I've realized recently, and I think it's very similar to the story you told, actually, is that what I think I'd hidden from my family was the kind of the hard work and the challenges that I'd put in to, like, publishing a book. I don't think they'd even, like, but, and it was partly because I thought I don't want to bore them with that, or, like, it was so the research shows, like, one of our kind of psychological barriers is that we're scared about revealing vulnerability, and we don't like talking about failures, even though people probably appreciate it when we do, because, like you said, it's relatable. Where we see weakness, they might see courage, all of this kind of thing. But I didn't know that, and so I would just ignore. Like, when you put together, like, a book proposal, like, it goes out to editors, and you can get, like, lots of rejections before you get the book deal. Like, that's just part of the process. But each rejection can feel kind of like a big blow. Like, it's often not couched in like the most tactful language. You've slaved away at something and then you're told that it's, not viable for whatever reason. And I had just never told my family these facts. And so I think they just kind of saw me just kind of cruising along, like doing things that they had never done. And I kind of, in hindsight, I really wish I had shared those kind of steps. And there's research to show this actually, that when you share your successes, you're also much better to kind of talk about the journey that got you to where you were, to that thing that was exciting. So like you said, like talking about the nerves that you had before meeting one of your kind of idols, talking about those rejections, what you learned from those rejections, all of those things can be really, really important for helping people to kind of connect where they are to where you are, and to show that your worlds actually aren't that different at all.
And it makes the achievement of the end result more impressive as well because it shows distance traveled.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. Otherwise, it looks like you were handed like this kind of whatever, however you're measuring your success, but it looks like you were just handed that achievement on a plate rather than, like you said, traveling the distance. Yeah.
That leads me on to one of your next laws, and it's around truth, lies, and secrets is the name of the chapter. What
Yeah.
effect does concealment have on our social connections?
Um, so I mean, like, we're all gonna have like some things that we don't want to tell like every person we meet, but having kind of, profound secrets that are, when we're concealing information that we think would actually be important for someone to understand, to really get us as a person, that can make us personally feel very lonely. And it can, when if the other person finds out that we've been concealing this information, it does kind of cause a fracture in that relationship, often, at least temporarily. Especially if I think it's very different if you go to the person and kind of tell them personally, compared to if they find out from someone else. So yeah, honesty, whenever it's possible, is definitely a really powerful way of creating connection. There have been studies that have asked people to just be as honest as you possibly can be for the next 3 days with whoever you meet. And you kind of expect that to be quite a brutal experience, to be honest. Like, you think all those little white lies that we tell people to smooth over situations, like not to avoid giving the negative feedback, to to cover up some of our own, like, things that we'd rather kind of draw a veil over, like, those failures and stuff. You think it would be horrible to just be totally honest without telling any white lies or concealing any information. And yet what you find is that actually, um most people's well-being is great after those few days. Like, they feel close to the people that they were talking to. They see a lot more meaning in the conversations that they've had. Like, they recognize that those interactions were somehow like more profound than, in if they just carried on as normal. And what I love is that the researchers even compared this intervention of being honest to being kind. Like, when people were told, just be kind to everyone you meet, as kind as you possibly can be. Um, it was still, there were advantages to being honest that you didn't see with the being kind.
It makes me think of an old Dr. Jordan Peterson lecture where talks about this concept of always be kind, but what in fact kindness is misconstrued by is instant gratification. So if you were
Mm.
to be kind to a little kid screaming for a cupcake, the kind thing to do in that context is to give the kid the cupcake. But in fact, what it distills is poor eating habits, perhaps a poor sense of nutrition, extra calories that are not helpful for the kid. So in fact, that honest approach of saying, Timmy, for example, this is not good for you. I know you want it, but this is not good for you. And being honest to why that is the case in the most infant friendly manner. That was a bit formal of me to say it in such way. But being honest in those situations, or for example, if you have a friend who is pale like me, for example, and I wear a color that doesn't suit the shade of my skin, the kind thing to do would be like most girls do in Instagram comments would be, "You look beautiful, you look amazing, you look fantastic." But in
Yeah,
fact, the truth of the matter is that the olive t-shirt that I'm wearing isn't actually good for my skin tone. That is kindness. That level of honesty is kindness. And I think you can be
right.
honest and be kind. You can be critical and you can be kind if it's packaged in that way.
Right, totally. And actually, like, when people realize that we've been dishonest, even if it was for good intentions, they, you know, it feels quite paternalistic, actually. Like you feel patronized, you can feel a bit insulted by that because, and it's frustrating if you feel that there was an opportunity for you to learn and grow and improve or to change. Like if you were just going out of your house and like you're wearing like a terrible piece of clothing and like the other people were like, oh, you look fantastic. And then you find out later in the evening that you look pretty awful. That's very frustrating for you. So there are a few situations, but they are quite limited where white lies are considered to be justified by most people. And I think that is when um, the negative feedback would be hurtful and there's nothing that the person could do to kind of change or grow from that situation. So there's no real benefit to hearing the truth. And the obvious example of that is like if someone is like they're kind of dressed ready to, go down the aisle to get married and then like their dress really doesn't suit them or their suit doesn't suit them. Like I can't see that anyone's really gonna welcome you telling them that they look terrible because it's only going to make the whole ceremony so much more painful for them. So yeah, we have to be a little bit careful, and I still think like you can be honest and kind, like the two don't have to be in opposition. We can always try to be as tactful, as constructive as possible. We can always offer our own help to try to support people to, make the changes that they need to make to kind of, change their behavior or to kind of correct the error. But we should I think too often we're just a bit lazy and a bit cowardly. We would rather take the easy way out. Like you said, it's instant gratification. We'd rather just say the nice thing to avoid a moment of awkwardness. But actually, our relationships are much more likely to thrive if we confront that awkwardness and go ahead anyway.
It makes me think of one of the later chapters in your book around constructive disagreement and why people take extreme views that they don't believe to avoid existential isolation.
Yeah, exactly. So, we see this a lot with like conspiracy theories that people who are lonely are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And one reason might be is that the kind of creating this whole new worldview that involves, some kind of deep state, intervention that no one else knows but your group of acquaintances, that is they might feel isolated from the rest of the human race, like from most people in society, but they can feel that they've got this shared reality, this kind of secret shared reality with those few people that they can talk to about these things. And the problem is that a lot of us, when we have these conversations, when we find out about someone's kind of conspiracy mindset, like if it's a relative or friend, we can only like accentuate their sense of isolation from from the outgroup, from people who don't believe in the conspiracy, by ridiculing them, by showing kind of disdain. We're only emphasizing this fact that they're not kind of welcome amongst your type of people, and that just pushes them back to the people who are kind of sharing the conspiracy. If they've already gone there because of their loneliness, any behavior that's going to emphasize their kind of loneliness is only going to push them further down that line.
I had a comedian called Jacob Hawley on the podcast a few months ago. Really good friend of mine, and we were speaking about how comedy has become a really good messenger, especially for me to learn about issues that I don't face. I've learned so much about race and um, uh, people from non-gender specific identities, people who are trans, people from the LGBT community. Um, I've learned a lot about the kind of problems and maladies that my sister has faced being a young woman. And I learned that through the voice of comedy because I came across a medium that was palatable and enjoyable for me and a messenger that I was willing to hear that information from. And the delivery mechanism was humor. So that was the perfect way for me to absorb that information and perhaps change my worldview on certain social causes. However, if you were to conflict that with perhaps a extreme activist, for example, who is very serious in their delivery and quite extreme in their delivery, I believe their opinions and the way they package their school of thought would actually deter me even further from thinking the same pattern of thought as them or being less receptive to that. But stand up comedy personally has been the ultimate vice to make me more progressive. Not that I wasn't progressive before, but I've become more
Yeah.
progressive, more open minded because I've enjoyed the medium and the messenger.
Yeah, exactly. And I think um, I have to be careful not to kind of get on my soapbox here because it's something that drives me a little bit crazy. Actually, is when you see activists, and I don't. This isn't restricted to any part of the political spectrum. I think that's what's so frustrating. But they're so passionate about what they believe, but they show so much disdain for the people who don't believe it, and that's just so alienating. It's like if your aim is to persuade people around to your point of view and to raise awareness of these issues, like getting nasty, doing these like ad hominem attacks on people, like making sweeping generalizations about the other group. It's never going to work, and that's not just my personal opinion. Like that's what the scientific research shows is that like incivility is a real turnoff for most people. Like you're turning away the people who might have been undecided on the issue, as well as those who are kind of on the kind of opposite side of the aisle. So in that kind of chapter, that in the laws of connection for dealing with kind of political disagreements or social disagreements on social issues, like the four fundamental things that we can do to persuade people and at least to have like good constructive conversations is to be civil, be curious, to recognize our own uncertainty, and to try to frame the issues in a way that appeals to the other person's moral values. So just try to talk to them in a way that they are going to understand. If you are going to ignore all of those things and you're just going to kind of shout and insult the other side, like I have to wonder what your motives really are. Like, are you actually, do you actually care about this issue enough that you want to kind of shift uh, the debate and public opinion? Or do you just want to kind of cement your position within your in group and to kind of climb the social hierarchy there by showing your commitment and passion? And I think the two are very different things.
I see that too. Many people are sorry. Many people are clashing shoulders when it comes to societal change. When I speak about women's safety, for example, I have to pitch to my guy friends that an increase in women's safety is a better outcome for men. Equally, I
Right.
pitch to my female friends that better mental health outcomes for men are also women's gains.
Yeah.
We all have women and men in our life, for example, and if we treat each other as partners in this transition, not just beneficiaries or not just an afterthought, then we're more inclined to create a collective approach. Same with when I think about the sustainability agenda or climate change agenda. When I think about the lower socioeconomic community, they are the first that are impacted and they're impacted the hardest. But when strategizing for climate change, they are an afterthought. We need to see them as a
Right.
partner in this green transition as such. So be it more than just a beneficiary. Same with the AI adoption, for example. We can either understand retrospectively how this impacts people from a lower socioeconomic background, or we can give them the skills and the access to language so they can be part of the debate and the strategization or the strategy of
Yeah.
deploying ethical AI, for example. And I think it's that toil of understanding that when when you champion a cause, it's not just the affected cause that benefits; it's everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of our kind of cognitive traits that we have is that we kind of view things in like very polarized ways, and we kind of assume that like two goals have to be opposing,
Mm,
and beliefs become attached like clusters of beliefs that don't necessarily go together become attached together, become attached and kind of coalesce. But actually, like they don't, all of these beliefs can coexist on all kind of areas of the spectrum. And lots of what I mean by that is, say, what I'm thinking about is, say, like you know, often like the people who believe in kind of free market economics and um, uh, kind of like like more kind of conservative with a small c kind of values, are more likely to oppose measures to prevent climate change. But actually, taking uh, taking steps to kind of provide a wider variety of energy sources can be an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs, and it could actually really boost the economy to do that. Like it could create a huge number of jobs. It could make some people very rich. Similarly, preserving the environment is actually something that is inherently conservative. Actually, it's like your heritage. It's something that you want to conserve for the future. So just because you have conservative values does not mean, and you place a value on like economic growth, does not mean that you have to be opposed to combating climate change at all. Like the two can very, very easily go hand in hand. But we see all of these things a bit like a zero-sum game. It's like either we do this or we do this. But actually, the way that we could be thinking is, how can we serve both goals? Like, what can we do? What policies can we enact to serve all of our goals?
As we come to the end of the podcast, David, I'm thinking about a more softer, warmer law to finish on, and it's finding forgiveness. Why is
Yeah.
forgiveness more powerful than revenge?
So basically, like I think we all know that sometimes revenge can feel quite sweet in the moment, but it doesn't make us feel great psychologically in the long run. Holding grudges in general is very bad for our health. Like it's in much the same way that social connection is associated with better health outcomes, with lower mortality, holding grudges is associated with worse health outcomes and higher mortality. And when you act in a vengeful way, you feel like you're redressing this kind of balance, like you're restoring justice. Well, that is why it feels so good. But what the research shows is that it actually detracts from our own sense of humanity. So you can do these studies that ask people, subtly ask them to kind of rate how similar they feel to to non-human entities like animals or robots, for example, and how much they feel they show like cognitive and emotional sophistication, which is a unique human trait. And what you find is that when people have enacted revenge on someone, even if it is something as simple as like writing a like pretty nasty letter to that person, they tend to they don't feel as human as they did before. They feel that they've lost something fundamental about uh, their kind of their uh, about their kind of core identity as a human being, and that I think that's like psychologically damaging in the long run. So that's why choosing forgiveness restores that sense of humanity. When we've been insulted, to take the moral high ground can actually make us feel like we're a better person and we're more human for having forgiven than for having um, than having acted spitefully.
And as we promised the listeners, we're going to give them 13 laws to change their life through connection. David, what's the final 13th law?
Yeah, the final law is to reach out to the people who are not with us physically, even like if they're old friends who you haven't seen in a long time, to kind of reach out and connect in whatever way you can. So could just be a text message, an email, a phone call, a Zoom call, whatever you can, but make that effort, because there's a lot of research showing that you will feel better for having done it. The other person will appreciate that a lot more than you recognize. It's almost like the liking gap at a distance. We worry that with our oldest connections that maybe like they've almost become strangers to us, and that they won't really want to hear from us again. Even if we're thinking of them, we don't think they're thinking about us. But that's, pretty much wrong on average. Like, they're going to really appreciate you getting in touch. And it's just one extra bonus way of enhancing your sense of social connection.
David, this has been fantastic. It's been completely eye-opening. If people want to reach out to you and buy your book, which is on screen for those who are tuning in on YouTube, The Laws of Connection, when can they anticipate being able to get their hands on this? I know it's not available just yet on Amazon, but when can they get their hands on this Bible for connection?
It's not long. It's coming out on the 6th of June. So I would say, you can pre-order it from any bookshop or any online supplier. Like, pre-orders really matter to authors, actually. It's one of the ways of kind of giving a book a little bit of momentum before it goes on sale, and helps to then carry it through the launch process. So yeah, please do pre-order it if you feel like you'd be interested. But you can also find out just more information about the book and me in general at my website, www.davidrobson.me.
This has been fantastic, David. This book, like I said before we hit record, is one of those guides whereby once you read it, you can't unsee it. You will be more deliberate in your communication and your connection. It's transformed my life in the last 24 hours since finishing it. I can't wait to see how my podcasts change and my conversations and my relationships, my friendships change moving forward because of your book, David. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much for your interest.